Hello, this is Deena Thomson, author of Fallen Poppies, and this is Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. Alan woke the next morning with a hop in his step and a whistle on his lips. He had done it. He could now give JoBeth the life she deserved. He splashed his face with the steaming hot water she had heated for him in a large iron pot. Wiping his face, he glanced at her. She knelt at the hearth, stoking the fire with a poker, her slender body silhouetted against the light. Taking in her narrow back, he grimaced. She was so thin. And yet still, he thought, she was well groomed, her hair arranged into a neat coiffure that showed off the latest fashion. Despite the state they lived in, she still looked flawless. "Here you go," JoBeth smiled, handing Alan his lunch wrapped up in a burlap bag. "It's leftovers from last night." "Thanks," Alan said, drying his face with an old towel. JoBeth stood uncomfortably before him, trying not to meet his gaze. She cleared her throat and started busying herself by tidying up the main room. There was a smaller room off to the side where Shauna and Jonah slept on the floor in blankets. Above was a loft the length of the house. "Are you nervous?" JoBeth asked, dusting the only chair in the room with a rag. She couldn't look at Alan's angular, chiseled face. "Not really. I'm used to carpentry work," Alan returned. This was the first time he had ever been totally alone with JoBeth, and he felt at a loss for words. Each time he opened his mouth, his tongue felt thick and heavy. "Well," she said, having no choice but to face him. He stood awkwardly with his lunch clasped in his hands. "You don't want to be late for your first day?" "No," Alan said, wide-eyed. He grabbed his hat off the chair where he had left it the night before and started for the door. "JoBeth?" He paused, keeping his back to the girl behind him. "Yes?" she asked, with her hands clasped together. Her heart began to pound anxiously. Had Alan noticed her condition now that she was not layered down with clothes? The boy faltered, not knowing how to tell her what he needed to say. He pressed his lips tightly together. It had to be done. It was the best for everyone. The blood drained from JoBeth's face. Alan had to know. She would be out in the cold once again. Maybe he would let her stay the winter? Please, God. "No one knows you and Jonah are here. I didn't think they should know," Alan said, looking embarrassed. This was the fly in the ointment, the one thing he still could not give JoBeth. "Why not?" she asked, surprised and a little relieved. "What about Shauna?" Alan stood in the doorway, his shoulders slumped and head bowed. A gust of wind blew through his thick hair. His heart was heavy with failure, yet again. Just when he thought he might succeed in her eyes, another obstacle was put in his way. He had hoped for something different this time. Instead, he found himself in familiar territory, standing like he always had, a shell of a man defeated yet again. "These people... Listen, we have been on the road for 2 months. Finally, we can live in a real house that ain't about to fall in on us. And it's ours. Not some shack we steal into the night and sneak out of during the day. I am paying for it monthly at the bank in town. I set it up with this Mr. Myers. He's some big shot at the bank. He said this place is for sale. We could get a horse and maybe even a buggy with my job. Shauna can go to school and be educated like them other proper girls. We can have real food, not these meager bits of scrap we've been living on. But if you and Jonah are found out," he stuttered, feeling ashamed. Could he ask so much of them? "Why?" JoBeth protested, her hands gripping the back of the chair. She wanted to lead a normal life again. The baby kicked her hard, a reminder of her present situation, and she blushed, shutting her mouth tightly. She had no right to an everyday life any longer, let alone to be seen in public. Because, Alan said, annoyed by Jo Beth's red face. He just could not stop disappointing her. Breathing hard, he ran his hand up the side of the rough wooden trim of the door and gazed down. One foot rested on the dirt floor of the cabin and one on the snow-covered step outside, trapped between two worlds. They don't take kindly to colored folks around here, Jo Beth. The memory of the previous day burned in his mind as he recounted what happened. I was at the lumber yard talking to the owner when a colored man walked by. The owner called him boy and towered over him, demanding to know why he was there. The man, Alan paused. He was a small guy, slender, no match for the owner. The expression on that man's face. Alan shook his head, trying to erase the image. It was fear, Jo Beth. Deep-seated fear. His eyes turned downcast. All he did was walk by. That was it, just walking by the shop. His eyes darted from the sight of her gaping mouth. I told him I'm raising my little sister who would be attending the school. Tonight after work, I'm gonna sign Shauna up, and later I'm gonna go to the store and get some credit so she can have dresses. I won't have the other kids laughing at her because she is dressed in rags. She ain't gonna be ashamed of where she comes from. Jo Beth nodded and wrapped her arms around herself protectively. We won't be noticed. Good. We need this. Alan turned his back to leave. An icy cold wind blew in, reminding them of the reality of the situation. A home, a job, food and shelter, survival. These were the only things that mattered. You're a good kid, Jo Beth. He reached up, adjusted his hat, and left without looking back. She stood alone, rooted inside the doorway, watching as he walked away until he was nothing more than a speck on the horizon. She placed a hand on her budding tummy, feeling the occupant twisting and turning safely inside her. Life settled down as the winter hit full force. Shauna started school dressed like an angel in the new clothes that Jo Beth made. Alan had even splurged and purchased a dress for her. Why waste money on store-bought dresses when I can make the exact same dress for half the price? Jo Beth scowled, disappointed with his extravagance. The other children will think she's too high class for them. She stomped off to the room she shared with Shauna and threw herself onto the straw bed Jonah had built for them. Alan's face flushed a deep crimson as he glanced awkwardly around the room, confused by Jo Beth's outburst. His feet instinctively took him out the front door. He paused to take a shuddering breath before bolting into the morning air. His shoes scuffed against the ground as he kicked random pebbles in frustration. He bought the dress to make up to Jo Beth for forcing her to stay hidden from the rest of the world. It hurt him that she couldn't live a normal life, a life he felt she deserved. Again, he had failed. Alan looked toward town, contemplating leaving early for work. He did not want to see Jo Beth's disappointed face. Shrugging his shoulders, defeated, he began walking down the worn path. A hand on his shoulder stopped him in his tracks. He turned to face Jo Beth's crestfallen expression. A storm raged in her eyes, filling with tears as she looked up at him. I will return the dress. I wasn't thinking right in my head. He fumbled, jamming his hands into his pockets. No, Alan. She shook her head. He looked at her wide-eyed, fearing he had done yet another thing wrong. I am the one who should be apologizing. I acted horribly and for no reason. Please forgive me. The dress is a beautiful gift, and Shauna loves it. She will be the envy of her schoolmates. Alan's jaw tightened. He was at a complete loss. As long as he lived, he would never understand women. I know things ain't been fair for you and Jonah with being hidden up here, Alan said. JoBeth lifted a pale hand in protest. "Alan, please. You have been trying so hard to give us a good life. We don't mind just staying around here. At least we have each other for company, and there is plenty of work to keep us busy." JoBeth winced, clamping her hand down upon her stomach. The familiar cramping across her middle ripped through her. She wondered if it was normal and wished she could talk to someone about the changes occurring in her body. Alan couldn't help but notice her pained expression. He went to her and placed an arm protectively around her shoulders. Her face became ashen, and her hand gripped her small, swollen belly harder. "You're not okay," Alan said, his voice firm, his brow furrowed in concern. JoBeth looked up at him, taking in the sharp line of his jaw and the warmth in his gaze. "Something I ate," she cringed, pain rippling through her. It was stronger and harder than before. Panting, she said she needed to lie down. Of course. Alan supported her back with his hand as they walked into the warm house. Jonah and Shauna were sitting at the newly built table and chairs. Jonah, it turned out, was an excellent carpenter. His handiwork was showing up everywhere in the dwelling, making the small home cozy and inviting. They both directed their attention to the door when Alan came bursting through it, practically carrying JoBeth. Jonah bounced up, knowing full well what was wrong with her. "She must be further along than I thought." He bolted to Alan, grabbing the other side of JoBeth. She grasped his hand painfully, her hazel eyes saturated with panic. "Get Alan and Shauna off. I don't want them to be late," she whispered to Jonah. He nodded in complete understanding. "Must have been that cabbage we ate. I got the same bellyache." Alan looked at Jonah with a questioning expression. He did not look sick. "Me and JoBeth ate a cabbage we weren't sure if it was good or bad. Guess it weren't." Jonah put his hand on his own belly and groaned. "Yep. What we need to do is lay down till it passes. Gonna end up in the outhouse all day. No work gonna be done today. No, not today. You and Shauna be no help to us sick ones. Better get yourselves off to your business. Nothing can be done for us with you here." Jonah shook his head, scooting the bewildered Alan and Shauna out the door. "JoBeth, I told you shouldn't have eaten so much of that old cabbage." Jonah eyed Alan. "See, JoBeth ate most of it. I guess that's why it's getting back at her worse than me." Hunched over in agony, JoBeth couldn't understand why Jonah was lying for her, but she was grateful. The pain began to subside. "Alan, please go to work. You and Shauna are already late. I will be fine. I already feel a little better. I just need to lie down for a bit." She straightened her rail-thin frame and walked alone to the bedroom. "If you think so." Alan hesitated. She did suddenly seem better. Again, he shrugged, not knowing what to do. He couldn't miss any work. If he did, he would lose a day's wages that were needed. He could see Jonah helping JoBeth to her room. The two boys now slept in the upstairs loft together. "Come on, Shauna," he said to the mystified child. She obediently grabbed hold of his hand. Shauna's slender frame trembled as she asked a question, her tiny voice barely above a whisper. "Is JoBeth gonna be all right?" She held her breath, her big eyes wide and hopeful. "Yes. She just ate something that didn't agree with her. Jonah will take good care of her." Alan stood in the doorway, ready to leave. His eyes were fixed on the room where JoBeth lay, her pale skin covered in sweat and her moans echoing through the door. He was glued to the spot, unable to look away. "I'm leaving," he yelled. From the bedroom, he could hear Jonah saying goodbye and a strained farewell from JoBeth. Suddenly, he felt he should stay. There seemed more to the situation than met the eye. Alan's free hand raked through his rusty brown hair, a habit he had when he was nervous and confused. Jonah did not really seem sick, and JoBeth would be in good hands. There was no reason for him to stay behind. It was just a feeling in his gut. But then again, JoBeth had seemed in a hurry for them to leave. Not knowing what to do, he turned away from the warm room with Shauna in tow and closed the door gently behind him. JoBeth did not seem to want him around anyway. She seemed quite happy to have Jonah with her. Jonah sat anxiously beside JoBeth. She withered on the bed in pain, clutching her extended abdomen. There was a sudden click from outside as Alan shut the door. The coast was clear. Jonah looked into JoBeth's twisted pale face. "It looks like your baby is gonna come," he said tenderly, smoothing the hair from her sweaty brow. JoBeth's eyes darted, surprised. "Does Alan know?" Fear mingled with her pain as she clutched her belly. "Nah, he doesn't know. But he's gonna have to know soon," Jonah said, rubbing her arm. She moaned in response, menstrual-like cramps boring through her again. "It's gonna be all right. I am figuring the reason you don't tell us about the baby is that you married a bad man. Makes sense you take yourself away from those hard types," he soothed patiently, trying to reassure her. JoBeth began to cry. How could she tell Jonah she was not married? "Now, we will have none of that. It'll be all right," Jonah comforted, glancing at JoBeth's hard belly. "You sure is small for your time to come." "That's because it's not my time yet. I'm only 6 months along." She spoke through gritted teeth, her body arching with each contraction that had come at regular intervals, getting more intense. It felt possessed, as though it wanted to turn inside out. Hard as she tried to stop it, it was doing its own thing. She squeezed her eyes shut to will the pain away, but each time a contraction hit, it was like something inside her was trying to rip her apart. Her screams echoed around the room as the agony increased. Jonah began to worry. 6 months was too early for the child to come. How would it survive? He frowned at the withering girl, who howled while holding tightly to her belly. "I'm gonna get some blankets to wrap the babe in, and some water to wash him." Jonah stood from the bed, his head hanging low. JoBeth's baby could not possibly survive. "Jonah, don't leave me," JoBeth sobbed, reaching out and grabbing the sleeve of his shirt. "I know it's too soon. Please, stay." Jonah closed his eyes and squeezed his full lips together. He nodded and held JoBeth's hand tight. "Ah!" JoBeth gasped, her contractions becoming one constant pain. "Talk to me, please." She panted, sweat starting to run down her face, and she held her breath, straining as the urge to push consumed her. "Maybe you should bear down if you have the urge," Jonah said, wiping JoBeth's face with a corner of the quilt she lay on. There was a basin of water beside the bed for JoBeth and Shauna to clean up in the morning. With all the commotion, she had not had time to change the water. Jonah looked around for a cloth and grabbed a damp towel resting on the floor. He quickly dunked it into the water basin and placed the towel on JoBeth's steaming forehead. "Thank you," she breathed and let out a blood-curdling cry. He reached behind her back and helped JoBeth situate herself, her chest pressing forcefully on her bent thighs. JoBeth pushed, her veins pumping furiously from her forehead. A warm gush of fluid poured from between her legs, soaking her and the bed. "Did I wet myself?" she asked, embarrassed. Jonah, who was now supporting her back from behind, whispered into JoBeth's ear. "No, JoBeth, your water broke. The baby's coming." He sighed. It was too late to go back now. The child would have to be born. JoBeth screamed in agony for 2 hours as Jonah slowly coaxed her into allowing him to see if the baby was starting to come out. At first, she had refused, mortified. But with each contraction, the pressure became too much, and soon she relented, just wanting it to be finally over. "I see the head," Jonah cried excitedly, looking up from between JoBeth's trembling legs and into her fevered face. A tiny head, the size of an apple, all covered in black curly hair, slithered out. Jonah turned the child's face upward and inserted his pinky finger into its small mouth, clearing the mucus. "One more push, JoBeth. Just one more," he said, holding firmly to the miniature head. She tightened her grip on her legs and closed her eyes, trying to gather all of her strength. She was exhausted and could not take much more. "You can do it, JoBeth. Please, one more push," Jonah cried out, noticing how fatigued she was. She braced herself and, straining with all her might, pushed. Jonah held the incredibly small baby as it slipped out. Infinitesimally small hands and feet flailed weakly. Never had Jonah seen anything so tiny. JoBeth collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, breathing heavily. It was over. Jonah cut the cord and wrapped the baby in a blanket, wiping the fluids from the birth off him. The baby was a boy, and he was alive. JoBeth turned, her face expressionless from the bundle of blankets Jonah held towards her with outstretched arms. She couldn't bring herself to look at it, shielding her eyes with a shaky hand as sunlight streamed in from the window, highlighting the painful truth of what she had just gone through. "What is it?" Her voice choked with emotion and reality that a new life had just been brought into the world. A frail, meowing noise came from the blanket Jonah held, almost like a cry of protest. Something pulled at JoBeth's heart. The child was her baby. It was not his fault how he had been created. "He's a boy," Jonah said sadly, noticing the tiny infant struggling for air. His small, scrawny chest heaved uncontrollably up and down. "Let me hold him," JoBeth said gravely, a tear sliding down her face. Jonah placed the baby into her arms. She moved quickly, lifting the blanket to reveal a small, curly-haired baby boy, dwarfed in the folds of the fabric. She hesitated as she looked into his eyes, 2 dark pools of innocence that seemed to peer directly into her soul. Her fingers fumbled with the buttons on her blouse. Her heart melted as she loosened a breast from her stays. She placed a nipple, darkened from pregnancy, into his small, gaping mouth. Her breast was nearly the size of the child. The infant tried to suckle, but it did not have the strength. As JoBeth cradled her son, she began to hum, her voice barely a whisper. The melody filled the room as Jonah watched with a sad expression as the baby fought against the spasms that racked his tiny body. With a light touch, JoBeth stroked the baby's head, and the spasms gradually subsided. "His name is Jonah," JoBeth sobbed, touching the soft, downy curls on the baby's head. She was not blind. She could see the irregular movement of the infant's chest. His lungs were just not developed enough. Jonah's voice cracked, overcome with emotion, as he watched the tiny baby struggle to breathe in his mother's arms. She ran her finger along the baby's tiny toes. Tears welled up in his eyes at the sight of the newborn's delicate fingers and rosebud mouth, overwhelmed by the beauty of this perfect little bundle. "You're my best friend, Jonah," JoBeth smiled through her tears. She reached out her hand to him. He clasped it between his palms, bending down beside her and the small newborn. He reached out his finger and placed it on the infant's small, transparent cheek. His finger took up most of the child's face. The baby looked at Jonah as though he recognized his namesake, and his little chest stopped rising. Jonah felt his tiny life leave. JoBeth let out a wail, the sound of a wounded animal, as she felt the baby's lips fall from her breast lifelessly. She clutched her dead child close to her chest, wanting to squeeze him back into her body where he was alive and well. "My little boy," she cried out in pure agony. Jonah, overcome with emotion, encircled his arms around JoBeth and the baby, scooping the two into the safety of his embrace. He rocked her back and forth in his arms as she cried, broken-hearted, for her son. They buried the baby in a tiny coffin that Jonah built in haste. He had prepared the wood earlier, planning to surprise JoBeth with a cradle. Tears fell freely as he nailed the small coffin's lid over the baby's wrapped body. JoBeth had enshrouded the child tenderly and lovingly in a soft blue and pink quilt that she had made just recently for Shauna. Tears fell silently as she kissed her son's curly head and handed the child to Jonah to place in the minuscule coffin. Weak as JoBeth was from the terrible ordeal of childbirth, she walked stiffly beside him, out into the backfield. She wore a shawl wrapped around her for warmth, and it hung limply, dragging on the icy ground. Jonah stopped at a clearing and looked at JoBeth questioningly. A cool breeze brushed her wet cheeks as she gazed around with an expression of resignation. Her voice low and devoid of emotion. "This is a good place," she said. Wildflowers would sway gently in the breeze, and the flutter of small wings would bustle out from hiding spots in the tall grass when spring came. She could imagine how it would be alive with nature. The place would be lovely. But for now, because it was winter, the tall grass pictured in her mind was standing yellow, poking out of its white winter blanket, waiting for spring and the warmth of summer to be reborn. Jonah placed a quilt on the tightly packed snow. He gently placed the coffin down and retrieved his shovel. It would be hard work breaking the frozen ground, but JoBeth had insisted that the baby be buried that day. Moving the coffin beside her, she sat down, placing her hand on the smooth surface, rubbing the grain of wood with her fingertips. Jonah worked with a fever all afternoon, digging the grave for his namesake. Tears refused to stop falling, and he could not look at the figure of JoBeth draped protectively over the wooden box. His heart ached to comfort her, but she didn't want comfort. She wanted the baby buried. So he continued to dig into the frozen ground, blinded by his own tears. When the grave had been dug deep enough, Jonah gently removed JoBeth's exhausted form, clenched tightly to the little crate. She then watched with vacant eyes and a heart as cold as ice as he placed the coffin into the hole. She struggled to stand up, her strength completely wasted. Jonah went to her and helped her stand, his large hand supporting JoBeth under her arm. She was weak as a newborn fawn, and as light as the snow that fell to the ground. Together, they walked to the foot of the grave, looking across the white field. Jonah cleared his throat and tried to think of a proper farewell for the infant named after him. "Go with the angels, little one. You won't feel pain ever again. God has got you now, sweet child. One day we will meet again." He spoke directly to the sky, as if he could see through it and right into the presence of the babe in heaven. JoBeth gazed up into Jonah's dark, wet eyes, her own eyes dry and distant, her heart deadened. "I don't want anyone to know about this." The words came out icy in a voice Jonah did not recognize. Not believing his ears, he stared at her in shock. "Why not?" JoBeth's voice was cold, sending shivers up Jonah's spine as she unburdened her story. She twisted the fabric of her skirt in her hands, a habit left over from the old life with her dead family. She bit her lip, the only movement on her expressionless face. "I was not married. My foster father made me, forced me to be with him." Her jaw tensed, but she did not drop her gaze. "I have committed terrible sin, and God has punished me by taking my son." She paused. She never voiced the horrible truth of her past out loud. Jonah's eyes widened in horror and confusion, and JoBeth wanted to curl into a ball and disappear. Her child was dead. Her beautiful, innocent baby was taken from her as punishment. The pain sliced through her chest. "I didn't deserve to have him, and I do not deserve to grieve for him aloud. My child was conceived through violence, and I wish he had never existed. Now I will have to live my life as though he never did." Her hands curled into fists. She could feel Jonah's bewildered gaze. She stiffly turned and headed back toward the house, leaving him to stare after her, baffled. Jonah ran a calloused hand over his face. He pulled out a faded red hanky from his pocket, wiping away the sweat and the tears that had been falling all day. He shook his head and sighed deeply before turning to the smallest grave he had ever seen. "Oh, girl, you did nothing wrong." He grasped the heavy wooden handle of the spade, his brows furrowing with sadness. The sun hung low, throwing long shadows across the small mound of earth in front of him. "But you got a lot of wrongs done to you," he muttered. "That blame you got nestled up inside, it's gonna eat you alive. God help you." He took the shovel in his hands and began to fill the grave with dirt, the clumps of earth hitting against the coffin like a dull thud in his heart.